Good evening. How are we all doing tonight? Awesome. Wow. Welcome. This has been a long, strange journey we've been on. This is the end of our lecture series, number six. For those of you who weren't here for the first five, shame on you, first of all. And second of all, my name is Jim. I'm the special events manager here at Hammond Castle Museum, and I want to welcome you to this evening's sixth and final lecture about the Folly Cove Designers. We did save the best for last. We did. To begin, tonight simply would not be possible without the generosity of some very extraordinary individuals. First of all, Ruth Pino from Remax, who made this all possible. So please give it up for Ruth. You know she's out there. Ruth, we love you, and we couldn't have done this without you. Second of all, we have the Mass Cultural Council, Gloucester Cultural Council, and please do give it up for the Manship Artist Residency, who gave us the screen to use. Yeah. Tonight is going to be a lot of fun. It's actually a great honor to introduce to you tonight a person who started out way back in the day as a co-worker of mine. We were both curators at the Cape Ann Museum when it was still the Cape Ann Historical Association, and has become a friend, confidant, all that good stuff. So, of course, I speak of the lady next to me, Elena M. Sarni. So who is Elena M. Sarni? You're probably wondering. Well, thankfully, I've got a little something to tell you. Elena M. Sarni is a humanities-based scholar, writer, and curator. She holds a BA in English and an MA in History and Museum Studies from the University of New Hampshire. Trailblazing Women Printmakers, the Virginia Lee Burton Demetrios and the Folly Cove Designers, is Elena's first book. It's the whole reason we're here tonight. Tonight, you're actually in the presence of greatness. Elena has dedicated over 10 years of her life to studying the Folly Cove Designers. I personally think her book should be called Everything You Thought You Knew About the Folly Cove Designers is Wrong. Dead wrong. No, this lady has discovered all kinds of great stuff. And this is going to be the first time tonight some of this is going to be heard. Yeah. So some little teaser there. You're going to be seeing some stuff that no one's seen before. And now you'll be able to tell your, great-great-grandchildren when you're bald and toothless, I was there when it happened. Yeah. So anyhow, enough of me. You didn't come here to listen to me babble. So it's at this point that I turn over to you, the microphone, and introduce you, Elena M. Sarni.
Well, thank you, Jim, for that warm welcome, and thank you to Hammond Castle Museum for inviting me, and to everyone who came out on this rainy night to hear me. I'm honored to be included in this series celebrating Gloucester's 400. It is especially meaningful to me to be here because Hammond Castle holds a special place in my heart. Let's see. Okay. That is me on the left and my sister on the right at Hammond Castle in the 1980s. My grandmother would bring us here quite often, so it's great to be back. For those of you who are curious, Trailblazing Women Printmakers, Virginia Lee Burton Demetrios and the Folly Cove Designers is the name of my book, and that is the cover that I was able to reveal a few weeks ago. And there is a QR code and a link. And I do have an Instagram that I'll be posting more like glimpses of the book on that as it gets closer. So August 29th is the release. Before I begin, I just want to tell you a little bit about myself and the journey of this book. I first became enamored with the Folly Cove Designers while working as the director of programs and assistant curator at the Cape Ann Museum. I continued to research and write about the group after relocating to Maine, and in 2010, I was asked to present a conference paper on the Folly Cove Designers at the Dublin Seminar for New England Folklife. The success of the presentation and publication of my paper in the conference's annual proceedings encouraged me to write a book on the group and their body of work. So yes, that was 13 years ago. But it should be noted that Virginia Lee Burton Demetrios, the founder of the Folly Cove Designers, worked on a design manual for over 25 years, but it was never published. So at times I worried that my book would fall to the same fate, but it will be released on August 29th. And that is the title. So thank you. Yeah, it's pretty exciting. And especially for my nieces who keep receiving things that look like a book and keep asking, is this the book? Is this the book? So now I can finally give them the book. During my years of research, I accessed primary source materials, including interviews with some of the designers, drafts and sketches of designs, homework binders, business records, correspondence. I also use newspaper and magazine articles, exhibit catalogs, and other secondary sources. And just, I have to say, even in the last 3 years, since COVID, so many more things became available. The Demetrios family donated 30 new boxes of materials to the Cape Ann Museum. So there was a lot to go through. The book is an illustrated history and features over 250 images. I had to fight hard to get this into the book. Many of the designs are printed in color for the first time. So I encourage you, if you buy the book, to read the image captions and even skim the endnotes, because there's details and new discoveries throughout the whole book. I also reveal several designs that what I'm calling lost to the public. They've been lost to the public over the years, primarily ones found in private collections. And I just spoke to a man tonight who may have found some new lost designs. So this is the table of contents for my book. And I just want to point out that, so as you can see, there's the second chapter is all about Virginia's design process. We won't really go over that tonight because that's more of a printmaking audience. Chapter 3 is on the business dealings of the Folly Cove Designers, and chapter 4 talks about the Folly Cove Designers' place in national craft history. But we are going to focus tonight in honor of Gloucester's 400th on chapter 1, which is a thing unto ourselves, and the Folly Cove Designers' roots and the community. But I want to just say that my book, it's very important to me that the Folly Cove Designers, it's noted that their work had a tremendous national appeal, and it transcended the rolling fields and ocean views of Folly Cove to find favor on New York's Fifth Avenue and beyond. So this picture is actually of the Lord & Taylor Fifth Avenue store window in August 1945, and I searched 10 years for this photo. So it is being revealed here for the first time tonight. I'm giving you guys a sneak preview. I don't know what my publisher will say, but I'm going to do it anyway. But so there are actually, I knew these photos existed, and I just kept searching for them. I'd heard them described in Dorothy Norton's notes, but I couldn't find them. So I finally found them. So it's pretty exciting. So within the first 10 years of organizing, the Folly Cove Designers were propelled to international fame through commercial contracts with major retailers, Lord & Taylor and F. Schumacher & Co., articles about the group in national periodicals such as Life, and participation in seminal craft exhibitions. And I also want to just point out that F. Schumacher recently re-released, after working with me on this book, I think 3 or 4 designs by the Folly Cove Designers. So they have wallpaper and yardage that you can buy from them, reproduction, and they changed the palette, but it's very good quality, and it's really exciting. And they were great to work with, and I found one design that had become lost to the public, and so that is one of the ones they re-released. So that's pretty exciting. Part of the impetus for writing the book was to cement the Folly Cove Designers' legacy as printmakers, craftspeople, and businesswomen during a time when all initial correspondence was addressed to the group presumptuously as gentlemen. And research indicates that most women spent 50 hours a week on housework. Like other women, members of the Folly Cove Designers did set the table for their families every night, only they did so while wearing aprons that they had personally designed, carved into linoleum blocks, printed, and sewn themselves. The women of the Folly Cove Designers forged their own roles in the world, something that today's female printmakers find highly relatable, and thus the group continues to inspire printmakers, particularly women printmakers. But again, in honor of Gloucester's 400th, tonight I will be focusing on the roots of this incredible group and the community of Folly Cove, as well as examining some of the designs that depict their beloved neighborhood. So much of tonight's presentation is taken from Chapter 1, titled A Thing Unto Ourselves, the Community of Folly Cove. And we'll just leave that there to admire for a little bit. Okay. A simple Yankee swap in 1938 between neighbors in the quaint neighborhood of Folly Cove in Gloucester, Massachusetts, design lessons in exchange for music instruction became the foundation of the Folly Cove Designers, one of the longest-running and most successful juried artist guilds in American history. Renowned children's book author and illustrator Virginia Lee Burton, of Mike Mulligan and his steam shovel fame, traded design lessons in exchange for violin lessons for her sons, leading to community-wide design classes and ultimately the formation of the famed eponymous block printing collective, which operated from 1941 through 1969. As a Folly Cove designer, Virginia used her married name, Virginia Lee Demetrios. Over time, at least 40 people became members. Several husband and wife couples joined the group. So I know my title the publisher chose was Trailblazing Women Printmakers, but there were about a handful of men over the years. Ultimately, the group produced over 300 distinct designs conveying personal and regional narratives through the use of shared design principles taught to them by Virginia. One member described the group as having grown out of the granite of Cape Ann, since the group's designs were largely inspired by the flora, fauna, people, and places of Folly Cove. So, and as you'll see, Folly Cove here, so this is, that's Lanesville, Folly Cove is here, Ipswich Bay is here. So it's pretty remote, especially back then. It's on the outermost point. And I love it because you can actually look out from Folly Cove Beach and see Mount Agamenticus, which is near where I live now. Gloucester had emerged as the destination for both artists and tourists in the middle of the 19th century as a result of the rail line that was built connecting Gloucester to Boston. Fitzhenry Lane, whom I'm sure Jim spoke about, and Winslow Homer are two of the many iconic American artists who were inspired by Gloucester's ocean views. Along with the quarries that were active on Cape Ann through the 1920s, fishing and art were the primary industries of the region at the turn of the 20th century. In a 1970s interview, artist Walker Hancock recalled getting his hair cut years before and how a man came into the barber shop and asked what the chief industries were in the area. The barber simply replied, "Fish and artist." 20th century artists in the Folly Cove area included the painter and etcher William Meyerowitz, his wife and fellow artist Teresa Bernstein, and in the 1930s, the painter Leon Kroll. Earlier artists included painter Ellen Day Hale, who first came to the area while studying with William Morris Hunt, and Gabrielle Deveau Clements, who was introduced to the area by her teacher, etcher Stephen Parrish from Philadelphia. Hale and Clements became good friends and bought homes in the area. Clements' home in Folly Cove was named The Thickets, and while Hale's was called Howlett's. Here they entertained many of their contemporaries. Some of their guests went on to join the community and made Folly Cove their own retreat, including two students of Clements's, Margaret Yetton Hoyt and Leslie Jackson. Clements frequently used locals as models. She, Hale, and Hoyt worked collaboratively on commissions for large murals. All three, along with Jackson, explored soft ground etching, a French process of color etching that was new to the United States at the time. They employed Uno Seppala, brother to an early Folly Cove designer, Vera Seppala, to help with the press. One local historian stated that Miss Hale was a leader to Folly Cove's art colony, composed mostly of women like herself who had stuck to their own guns and studied art despite family traditions of becoming decorative hostesses while men achieved their own goals. Hale, Clements, and their friends set the stage for the largely female Folly Cove designers who followed. As many of you know, the Folly Cove area was also a mecca for sculptors in the early 20th century, due in large part to the presence of renowned portrait sculptor and professor at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in Philadelphia, Charles Grafley. And here he is, no date unknown, photographer unknown, but most likely in his studio in Philadelphia. Grafley, who also taught at the School of the Museum of the Fine Arts in Boston, established a summer home and studio in Lanesville in the early 1900s, and his students followed him. Walker Hancock, Paul Manship, and George Demetrios eventually settled in the area. Virginia Lee Burton and George Demetrios. George Demetrios emigrated to the United States from Greece in 1911 and made his first visit to Folly Cove while studying with Grafley. Grafley died in 1929 and bestowed the lifetime use of his studio to George. By this time, George had established his own drawing school, holding classes in Boston during the winter and Folly Cove during the summer. Virginia Lee Burton, affectionately called Ginny by loved ones and friends, worked as an illustrator for the Boston Evening Transcript from the late 1920s to the early 1930s, her assignment being to create visual profiles, as she had proven herself gifted at capturing action and motion, including prize fights, though she said that she felt self-conscious sketching at them. She signed her work during this time as V, capital V, Lee, capital B. In 1930, Virginia enrolled in one of George's drawing classes. They fell in love and married a year later. George and Virginia moved to Folly Cove full-time in 1932 with their newborn son, Eris. Virginia gave birth to their second son, Mike, in 1935. George continued teaching and sculpting in Folly Cove. Virginia began to write and illustrate children's books. Choo Choo, published in 1937, was the first book that she both authored and illustrated. She published under her maiden name, Virginia Lee Burton, and went on to gain tremendous distinction, especially for Mike Mulligan and the Steam Shovel, 1939, her Caldecott Medal winner, The Little House, 1942, and she has a Folly Cove design by the same name, and Katie and the Big Snow, 1943. In the late 1930s, Virginia was mother to 2 young sons, as well as a children's book author and illustrator. Despite the demands of an already full life, Virginia took on yet another endeavor, offering design lessons to her neighbors, which would lay the foundation for the formation of the Folly Cove Designers. And we all know probably the famous Gossips design. An early design by Virginia titled Gossip references her dual identities as author and designer by humorously illustrating 2 women swapping secrets over their mailboxes, which bear 4 different sets of initials in a repeating pattern. So let's see, you have FCD for Folly Cove Designers, I Know Clark for her friend that taught the violin lessons, and VLB, Virginia Lee Burton, her name as an author, and VLD, Virginia Lee Demetrios, the name she used as a Folly Cove designer. And I will just hint, I am sorry I can't show you, that there's, that this may not have been the first version of Gossips to exist. So you'll see that in the book. The origins of the Folly Cove Designers. The most popular origin story of the Folly Cove Designers, as previously mentioned, is that the design lessons started as a Yankee swap between neighbors in 1938. But in further research showed that one account has Virginia approaching Ino Clark about Ino giving her young sons violin lessons, and another version has it being piano lessons. In exchange, Virginia offered Ino lessons in design. Yet another story cites the high cost of illustration supplies as the reason Ino Clark solicited design lessons from Demetrios, although Demetrios refused payment. However they started, neighbors soon caught wind of the lessons. Group classes were taught by 1939, which led to the formation of the eponymous Folly Cove Designers. So this is one of the photos from Life magazine, and Virginia is right here wearing her spring lambs design. And this was, and then we have Ino Clark right here, Libby Holleran, we have Louise Kenyon, and Hillia Burton also, so Virginia's sister-in-law. And as you can see, it's interesting because most of the women are wearing either their designs or one of their friends' designs in the picture. And Virginia really did teach with these, you can't really see it, this picture was cropped a little, but these huge poster boards that she would create for her students. And so some of those are in the book as well. Virginia's son Eris later described the first class as being comprised of students who came from a walking radius of the barn. Indeed, participants were either from the immediate area or had been personally invited. Many members of the original design class were descendants of Finnish families who had moved to the area to work in the quarries. In fact, out of the initial class, so this is 1940 before they were officially the Folly Cove Designers, only 2 students weren't Finnish. So the Finnish community, Lanesville was a predominantly Finnish community at this time, as was nearby Folly Cove. During the years from 1892 to 1920, the Finns were drawn to Lanesville as a place to live simply in a group and enjoy the social activities much as they had done in Finland. A community center was built in 1897 and was maintained by the Temperance Society of Lanesville, which was an important part of the Finnish community. Besides hosting plays, dances, and athletic programs, the hall was where the women held their rag-cutting parties in preparation for weaving rugs. Coffee socials were also held, and nisu was served. Church services at the Lutheran Church were conducted in both English and Finnish until the early 1950s. Finnish Americans remember speaking Finnish at home while learning English at school and picking it up from their Yankee friends and neighbors. Their parents, would speak a mixture of English and Finnish that the children referred to as Sfinglish. The Finns in the area retained a lot of cultural pride despite the eventual assimilation of the first and second generations. Early Finnish members of the Folly Cove Designers often credited their skill in music and art to their Finnish heritage, and having, as one Finnish designer described it, brains in their hands when it came to art and handicrafts. So this is Sauna by Ino Clark, and this one is actually printed on paper, which sometimes they would do that. But mostly they printed on fabric, as you know. Saunas were prevalent in the neighborhood as it was a Saturday custom for Finnish people to take their baths. And this is a quote: "To those early Finnish quarrymen, the sauna was so important that many times the bathhouse was built before the house was begun." There were both private and public bathhouses throughout the 20th century, and they were quite a center for the community. And Ino and Virginia actually took saunas together almost every week. Along with running a dairy farm, the Seppala family operated a public sauna and charged 15 cents per head. And so I just also want to point out that this design in the early years, so this is one of Ino's first designs and probably exhibited in the 1940 exhibit. So a lot of the designs at this point were vertical and they were narrative pieces. And so they're vertical and you read it from left to right, top to bottom. So you start off with, sitting in the sauna, and then, usually you go up in the tiers to the higher levels of heat, and then switching yourself for the circulation. And then this row here I find really interesting because there aren't that, even though there were mostly mothers in the group, there aren't really that many maternal depictions in most of the designs. So this is actually one of the few designs that shows a maternal depiction. And then, of course, doing that final cold rinse. The Folly Cove Designers process. Design lessons would start each fall and span the long winter months. The lessons centered on design principles that could be applied to many art forms. Initially, the group considered applying their designs to pottery, but ultimately chose linoleum block printing, primarily because the equipment and supplies were inexpensive and accessible to all members. Virginia had studied with printmaker Robert Hessward in her teens, which may have further influenced the decision to concentrate on block prints. And so this is the book Goppy, and the cover illustration is by her teacher, Robert Hesswood. And for those of you who are familiar with Folly Cove Designers, this wave pattern actually became a signature design element in many Folly Cove designs. So I just wanted to show his work and show his influence on the Folly Cove Designers. And in her design manual, she actually, in the dedication, mentions Robert Hesswood. The design process started with each designer selecting one subject to study for that year's class, which would become the basis of a new design. The winter was spent sketching the subject repeatedly, refining the design, then carving the block, and finally printing the design onto fabric. So this is the homework for one of two of Peggy Norton's apple pie designs. She had apple pie and apple pie small. So Peggy was a very ambitious student. She completed all of her homework, which often was very repetitive. But she was also very modest, because years later she said that if Ginny had been doing this, you would have been able to tell what kind of apple it was, Macintosh or Baldwin. But I think Peggy's pretty good. And this is Apple Pie, 1951. And I love this because Peggy was just so detailed in everything. You have, and I don't even know if people often realize the rolling pins as the border on the outer border there. But starting with, the seeds and the apples and the trees, and then what goes into an apple pie, and just the details of like the rolling pins. It's just really gorgeous work. Students were encouraged to find inspiration for their subjects from the natural world around them rather than use photographs, especially in the beginning. This led to some very interesting stories about designers struggling to get animals to hold poses. Peggy Norton described feeding a mouse sunflower seeds so that she could observe it for her design, Cranberry Bog, which is another beautiful design that is in the book. Finnish culture and Scandinavian design aesthetics were also apparent in many Folly Cove designs. Ilmari, called Jimmo Natty, most clearly demonstrated this with his block prints depicting the Kalevala, a 19th century epic poem compiled by, and I hope I'm not mispronouncing these names, Elias Lönnrot from Finnish folklore. Ilmari was one of the members in the very early days before they'd officially formed, and so Ilmari is related to, he married Pauline Manship, and he was brother to Robert Natty, brother-in-law to Lee Natty, and brother to Aino Natty. And so he was in the group. He didn't necessarily work in the traditional style of the Folly Cove Designers, but he was known for his really stark use of blacks and whites. So it's a real pleasure that his family showed me some of his work, and I'm able to include it in the book. And this was exhibited in the 1940 exhibit. At the outset, to transfer the designs to fabric, the carved linoleum blocks would be inked, then set on the fabric, and jumped on literally by the designer to print the image. The practice was physically challenging and may have been responsible for at least one broken ankle. Virginia's. So it was likely a relief to most neighbors when the group began upgrading to hand-operated proof presses in 1943. And so this was like a full body workout, 1948. And the screen in the back, this is Ino Clark in Virginia's studio, and this carving was actually, it's another facet of Virginia's work that people aren't always aware of. She also did beautiful wood carvings. So this is Ino again, with one of the group's there were different styles, and this is one, and you'll see the Acorn press at the Cape Ann Museum, and this is another one of the presses that produce pressure from the top down, but still required quite a bit of strength. In general, the designers worked alone in their homes, except for the design lessons and monthly meetings where the designers convened to critique one another's work. Until the late 1940s, when most of the members had acquired their own presses, members who had them would often share their presses with those who didn't. And Libby Holloran gave an interview where she talked about running out after dinner when her kids were little to run up the street to Dorothy Norton's to use her press. Throughout the group's history, only Ruth Hendy and Barbara Bisbee Sousa Hoffman seemed to be the exception to this solitary style of working. Close friends, they would work on their designs at one or the other's kitchen table, placing their young children in a playpen together. Multitasking. In 1941, the group officially organized under the name Folly Cove Designers and named officers. Virginia refused the title of president, but everyone recognized her as the group's leader. In 1943, they decided they would operate in the same way that craft guilds dating back to medieval times had. They would form a jury, and only upon its approval could a design be considered an official Folly Cove design. And so this didn't make it into Life magazine, but this was another photo taken for the Life magazine spread. And it appears on the cover of my book, and it's just a beautiful image. I love the round table that was in Virginia's studio that I saw years ago at an estate sale. And Virginia, again, wearing her spring lamb's dress. And so you have, and they're just reviewing the designs. You have Virginia, Ino, Louise, Hetty, Betty, Burlingham, Whitney, a long name. She had 3 to begin with and then got married later in life. And then Ida Bruno. Upon completion of their first jury design, students were awarded a block-printed diploma featuring Virginia's design, The Making of a Block Print, and became official members of the Folly Cove Designers. So this is the iconic diploma. And one thing that I love to point out, again, an early piece, this is vertical, another narrative piece being a Virginia piece. And you read it from top to bottom, left to right. And it just shows you like the thinking of the design, the carving, the reviewing, just all the different stages of the design, and then stomping on it and then revealing it. But what I also love is that to point out is this sort of secondary storyline that runs throughout, that has the different tools, the bolts of fabric, the design books up here, the different tools here, the fabric again, and it just keeps your eye moving, but also serves as a parallel storyline. But again, just there's always so many layers and details to every design. So I will say, in the 13 years that I've been studying this subject, I've never gotten bored because I'm always discovering something new or noticing something that I didn't notice. And it's just wonderful. The group wrote formal rules and regulations by the mid-1940s to ensure the quality of the product, the standard of their brand, and also possibly to comply with the requisites for trademarking their name and logo, which they did, which was very forward-thinking of them. Members were considered designer craftsmen, which meant that they each were responsible for his or her work from start to finish, from design to print. Only the sewing of clothing items and the signature fringing of their table linens, which they all dreaded, could be farmed out. The rules stated clearly that the goal was for each designer to create at least one new design per year, which was pretty ambitious, given the quality and the detail that went into each design. Those who joined the Folly Cove Designers after the first group of students, for the most part, came with some degree of art or craft experience. The annual class size varied, but averaged about 12 designers. Over the group's lifespan, it wasn't unusual for people to be members for only 1 to 3 years. But by the mid-1940s, a core group of designers was established. These individuals remained part of the group until it disbanded 1 year after Virginia passed away in 1969, and it included, Virginia until her death, Ino Clark, Libby Holleran, Louise Kenyon, Ano Natty, the one enduring male member, Lee Natty, Dorothy Norton, and Peggy Norton. And the book includes in-depth bios of each of these 8 core designers. But that's not to diminish the roles of all the designers. And the book also includes bios on several other key members. So as mentioned before, the designs conveyed both regional and personal identities and narratives. And of course, they were narrative because, Virginia Lee Burton being a storyteller. And it was around the early 1940s that they settled on the horizontal 11 by 17 size. And that really came at the suggestion of one of their first retail clients, America House in New York City, who at that time was led by Frank Lloyd Wright's daughter, Frances Wright Corot. Subject matter was the focus, but size and scale were equally important, as well as gradations of color. And the negative space was just as important as the positive space. So this is just a photo of Virginia Lee Demetrios and a pet sheep. And then this is what became known as Spring Lambs 1, because she went on to do another Spring Lambs design. This was Spring Lambs. But again, you have these beautiful borders, and the sense of movement that Virginia was able to convey is just amazing. And you can almost feel the fuzziness of the sheep. I'm sure most of you have seen these designs. They're sort of local favorites, but I wanted to show them because, we are celebrating Gloucester's 400. So Polyphemus was by Ano Natty. So some of his designs often were, so this was inspired by his time as brakeman at the granite quarry, working as the brakeman. And some of his other designs and work, he did a few other granite designs that were discovered later in a private collection. And he also did depictions of his time in World War II. So some of his designs had a more masculine feel. But you see FCD Railroad there. And again, this design is working from the top to the bottom. But by then, the format was the 11 by 17 format. But one thing I do want to point out about Ano Natty, Jim was always joking about this, was that I didn't show one of his pieces, but he did a lot of pieces that had roosters in them. And the joke was that he was always depicting roosters as the male in the group. So this is actually from the Kenyon family. This is the sketch that Louise used for the famous Head of the Cove. So you have, that's Louise in her garden. That's the Kenyon home. That's Peggy Norton's house. The Anasquam Church. So, and this appears in the Life magazine spread. So this is the first time this has, I think, been published since the Life magazine. And this slide, so photos were used here, and I don't know if you noticed, or in the Lord and Taylor store windows, they actually, and maybe she had taken them, she was either allowed to use them as study photos, or these photos do appear with the Head of the Cove fabric that Lord and Taylor printed in the Fifth Avenue store windows. So this is the Kenyon home. And this is Louise's son, Paul, with the wheelbarrow that you saw in front of the Norton home in the design. And this is her younger son, Peter, chasing a chicken, which also appears in the design. And so this is Head of the Cove, which is one of my favorites. I love this design. But I also just want to drop a hint that, like Gossips, this may not have been the first version of Head of the Cove. But this is a very refined version, and it actually, it's very much like the sketch. And then here is Peggy Norton's house, story and a half. And again, Peggy, just a master for carving. I mean, to be able to carve something, these are little houses here. So this is her quirky house that is near the Kenyans. And she did, but Peggy, because as I said, she did all of her homework and just like got immersed in these subject matters. She did 2 designs based on her house, but then actually did, in the book, you'll see she carved several other blocks. So in order to carve them, they must have been given jury approval, but they weren't the standard size. So sometimes they were used for the skirt waistband or a Christmas card. But it's very interesting because many versions of different versions of a story and a half. Her home was definitely an inspiration for her, our overachiever. Okay, the annual exhibition. So every year from the inception of the Folly Cove Designers, there was an annual exhibition of that year's designs. The first year in 1940, Virginia's students exhibited their work at her home studio as they did the next year's work to an audience of 150 people. The Gloucester Daily Times gave the exhibition a glowing review. After hosting subsequent exhibitions in Annisquam, at Squam Mill, and Rockport, the group started renting the Demetrios barn on Washington Street, Route 127, in the heart of Folly Cove, and it eventually became the group's retail outlet. And I'm sure you all have passed by this iconic building that I believe is now a private home, but looks, it's still recognizable. And that is probably Peggy Norton's car out front. The annual exhibitions grew in size, especially after the group established their own retail space in the Demetrios' barn. The group began extending their exhibition season, and it ran from March through early December. Originally, they just started out doing a few months in the summer. Members took turns working at the barn, including printing demonstrations open to the public several days a week. Each year, a new design was selected for the cover of the exhibition invitation, or designed specifically for it, and mailed to the group's mailing list. So this is one of my favorites. This is by Ano Natty, and it depicts an exhibition opening. You see, it's a very kind of Virginia type design with the bowed roof here. And you'll see that in a few of the different Beatty also used the bowed roof to show that it was bursting at the seams, the building. But this really did depict, they would hire a policeman to help escort people across the busy road, and they would have the tent with the food, and Virginia's dog might make an appearance, and just tons of cars would be lined up along 127. Opening day was always very joyous, reminisced one designer. The exhibit openings were the social event of the season, not just for the designers, but for the local residents, summer people, and loyal customers. Everybody came. All the artists and the people from New York who spent the summer up there, they all came. Following the opening, Virginia and George would host an after party, which consisted of a lobster bake and dancing, and was remembered fondly by the designers. During the party, new designers were awarded their diplomas. Once a student member had graduated and become an official designer, the other designers would often give the graduate one of their own designs to celebrate the accomplishment. So a lot of times in private collections, you'll find, you'll find obviously a large amount of the designer's work, but you'll find a lot of pieces by other designers as well. This process of exhibiting and graduating was meaningful to members. For most of the Folly Cove designers, seeing their year's work exhibited served as a major incentive to continue producing new designs throughout the year. One designer explained, "You looked at it, the exhibit, with breathlessness, thinking of the total hours that each designer had put into it, and sometimes just carving alone could take 50 to 100 hours. on the creation of their idea and then the printing of it, cutting the block and all. It just totaled up to an aggregate beyond what anyone could imagine. And then this section is a little more extensive in the book, but I call it Blocks and Bees. Folly Cove was a cooperative community. The Demetrios' younger son, Mike, remembered building bees to clear land for neighbors' homes. The able-bodied men would gather for a day to do the work, he said, adding that his father would oversee the work crew, of course. George was a very outspoken man. Mike's brother Eris remembers there being between 70 and 80 people at these bees. Mike, Eris, and their dad were all working at one of these bees in 1948, shingling their cousin Costa Maletskos' house when they got word that their own house was on fire. Eris remembers neighbors jumping in to help remove items from the home. And Eris told me a funny anecdote that the way he remembers it is that the pianist removed the piano from the home and the sculptor was running in to get the sculpture and things like that. And the painter, the paintings. And so that's, in his memory, that's how it played out. This philosophy of helping neighbors was ingrained in the Demetrios boys. Mike, in particular, recalls that he once got in trouble for taking payment from Leon Kroll for mowing his lawn all summer. When George found out, he made Mike return the money. Given the tales of high-spirited dancing, barbecues, afternoon swims, nature walks, and cooperative projects, it is hard not to view Folly Cove as an idyllic community. Eris acknowledged that many people moved there due to the sheer magnetism of my parents, and added, I mean, it really was a marvelous kind of social agenda that went with it. Designer and neighbor Lee Steele described Virginia and George as deliberately, but not consciously, creating an intellectually stimulating community in which to raise their two boys. She called their home a social center for the area, but she felt strongly that the members of the Folly Cove Designers and the people who were allowed into George and Virginia's inner circle were definitely chosen. And so this is one of my favorite designs, sort of crops, but this is Finish Hop by Virginia, again showing her excellent ability to convey motion. But you have Lee Natty here and Robert Natty, and Lee could always pick herself out by her pigtails flying in the air. You have Jimmo Natty and Pauline Manship. I believe this is Costa, and I think this is Virginia. Eris Demetrios described the Folly Cove Designers as having their own belief system, and he noted the fact that they created their own culture. Lee Steele agreed, explaining that the community was a thing unto ourselves. The Folly Cove Designers' work represents a permanent visual legacy of this vibrant community, communicated in the compelling language of pattern. It has been an honor to document their incredible artistry, and I look forward to sharing my book with the world. So thank you very much. Yeah, it really, it's just a subject that I'm so passionate about, and I'm just so excited for people to see the book. And, you know, there will be little breadcrumbs for future researchers to pick up on, and there will be new things that come to light from the book that will, trigger people's memories, and things continue to come from private collections and attics and things like that. And so it's a very exciting time. And knowing that before me, there was, a professor who worked on she was actually still working on the book actively when I was at the Cape Ann Museum. She worked on the book for almost 20 years and conducted these amazing interviews, which I'm very indebted to her scholarship for being able to infuse the book with so many anecdotes. But, she worked on the book for 20 years and then walked away from the material. So Penny Martin, I'm very indebted to her work and other scholars before me, but I'm so blessed to have been able to, I'm proud that I stuck it out, but I'm able to bring it to fruition. So thank you. That is Folly Cove Beach from Lee Steele's And then beyond that is Mount Agamenticus, but that was the view from Lee Steele, who passed away last fall. Her yard, and she and Virginia would swim. But this was 2010 when I interviewed her. So this is the book again. And then just as teasers, besides the designs Head of the Cove and Gossips that I mentioned, there will also be some reveals on designs, including Virginia's designs Reducing and Fish Stories, and then also Louise's Pigs and Clover design. But yeah, it will be fun. Okay, questions? Yes, sir. Well, in Virginia's case, she often would roll out one, or in the case of Fish Story, which I stumbled upon. I stumbled upon a private collection, and there was just a slight difference. And then I found an article that mentioned that she actually produced 2 Fish Stories. So so in her case, yes, she often, like Peggy Norton, would become so passionate about a subject, and they did so much work to get to the point of, you know, being able to carve the block, that she used the material. So she did, you know, several train designs for the Folly Cove Designers, some of them in the same year. So in her case, she often did roll them out in the same year. In the case of Head of the Cove, it does look like it was redone, and it might have been triggered by a comment by the staff at F. Schumacher. So that one's a little bit more of a mystery on the timeline of it. But I realized that, I mean, it's just exciting because you'll see the drastic difference between the 2 versions, and it's amazing. And then you'll go back to your own collection and see, do I have the first one or the most recent one? And you'll want them both. Yes. Oh, F. Schumacher. Yes. So online, I think they're just going by Schumacher now. They have a section called Collaborators, and I did a blog post for them and gave them a little bit more history on. So it was one of Louise's designs, and then Beatty. And so I think 3 designs by Schumacher, but a leading design powerhouse. So yeah, definitely check that out. Oh, Schumacher, Schumacher. Yeah, you're welcome. And there are Schumacher stores. There's one in London and Paris, which I would love to go to with copies of the book. But there is one in Boston and in New York as well. So some designers, so in chapter 3, I delve into, which not everyone likes to hear that part of the designers, but it is actually pretty interesting to hear the financial, like what the money ended up being pretty significant for some of the designers. Like it paid for children to go to college. It really was a significant amount of income. So yes, Dorothy Norton was hired to become secretary. It did take her away a bit from her own designs, but she kept very accurate books, and I'm very indebted to her for her recording. Finally, in the 1950s, she started typing things, so it became a little bit easier to read. But she always would title, like she might call something Spotted Pony, and then the next time it would be Polka Dot Pony, or so. Like she'd call things different names, but she kept amazing records, and so she would list the new designs. So that is a great piece of research material. And she also kept the financial records, retail, wholesale, who their retailers were, who their wholesalers were. And in the book I go into some of the reasons why. They had this tremendous commercial success in the first 10 years, and then they pulled back, which was more of a personal decision, but also was in keeping and timing with their opening of their own retail store. Yeah. Yes. I mean, I do go in, so they would get basically almost like a signing fee, and that would go directly to the designer. And they were very competitive. One executive told them that they were commanding prices higher than any other New York designers, textile designers at the time. So they would get either 100 from 75 to 200 just for doing the original design. And then the proceeds from that design, they would give a percentage to the group, which would pay for Peggy and I'm sorry, Dorothy Norton's income, for her salary and for office supplies and for the things that kept the barn running, heat and postage and all those things. But then most of the money they would get to keep. And she kept meticulous records, but I do go into it and break it down with like how much was the percentage they gave to the group. And then I don't specify by name because I didn't want to single out any families, but I do go into, some of the highest earners, what that money would mean in today's time, which really was significant. Yes, ma'am. Well, some of them are a lot. There's a huge collection at the Cape Ann Museum, which is where I first discovered their work when Jim and I were working there. And then Sandy Bay Historical Society has a wonderful collection. And I'm hoping that with the new facility, they'll be able to exhibit more of it. And they were very generous and let me just come in and photograph everything and didn't charge me. They were so magnanimous. And then families have held on to things. And so like with the Kenyon family, I discovered, several designs that were lost to the public, and Louise had kept clippings and things, and I was just able to learn so much. So there were archival pieces and then blocks and from the early days where it might just be like the border, like that wave pattern that was used for like a skirt waistband or something. But so private collections, and there's a few antique dealers in the area who work and represent estates, and I've been working with the Irabino family, and they still have a huge amount of their parents' work, and their mom and dad both were Folly Cove designers, and they were one of they were in the group for about a decade, and so they were one of the most long-standing couples to be part of the group. Yes. So Isabel Natty, so Ano's niece, Isabel Natty, Ilmari's daughter, she worked with Libby Holleran, who opened her own store and was given permission even by the group, which was rare, to sell some of her Folly Cove designs. But Isabel had her own style, and I was fortunate enough to know her really well when I worked at the Cape Ann Museum and get to know her, and I would hang out at the Sarah Elizabeth shop and watch her work. But she had her own style, but she was a wealth of knowledge, and she actually was the one who printed her dad's the prints from the Kalevala, her dad Jimo's work, Ilmari, and those were prints on paper. So she did amazing work herself. She worked with Libby Holleran, who was a Folly Cove designer, but she had her own style as well. And then obviously other printmakers have worked in the same spot. And then so many friends that I know, I have so many friends that are printmakers that we've met through a shared love of the Folly Cove designers. There's this whole community internationally that just adore the work of the Folly Cove designers, especially printmakers. And we've met on Instagram. And so I've shared my Instagram because often it's a great printmaking community on Instagram. So. Thank you guys so much. You're a wonderful audience.